My nephew said, "The camp counselor takes photos of us changing after swimming and says it's for the camp website." Ethan said it while reaching for another slice of pizza across my kitchen table, his voice carrying that casual tone 11-year-olds use when they're not entirely sure if something is normal or not. I'd picked him up from Pinecrest summer camp an hour ago because my sister Laura and her husband Keith were both stuck at work. Ethan had been going to Pinecrest for 3 summers now, and I'd heard countless stories about archery competitions, campfire songs, and swimming races. But this story made my hand freeze halfway to my beer. I'm Derek Mallory, a criminal defense attorney who'd spent 15 years watching prosecutors build cases against people accused of terrible things. I'd seen enough evidence, heard enough victim testimony, and reviewed enough predatory patterns to know that what Ethan just described wasn't camp photography. It was documentation for something much darker. I set down my beer and kept my voice steady. "Tell me exactly what happens when this counselor takes photos. Where are you? What are you wearing? Who else is there?" Ethan shrugged and took a bite of pizza. "It's after swimming lessons. We go back to the cabin to change out of our wet swimsuits. Counselor Ryan says the camp website needs action shots of daily activities, so he takes pictures while we're getting dressed. He has this really nice camera with a big lens. Sometimes he asks specific kids to pose, turning around or bending over to pick up their shoes. He says natural, candid shots look more authentic than staged photos." My stomach turned over. I'd defended men accused of producing child exploitation material. I knew exactly what Counselor Ryan was creating, and it wasn't camp website content. The scenario Ethan described was textbook grooming paired with exploitation. A trusted authority figure with access to vulnerable children, a camera presented as official camp equipment, instructions designed to capture compromising images while the children were partially or fully undressed, and a legitimate-sounding justification that normalized the entire process. I pulled out my phone and opened the Pinecrest camp website, scrolling through the photo galleries. There were hundreds of images showing kids doing typical camp activities: roasting marshmallows, climbing walls, playing volleyball, swimming in the lake. But I noticed something immediately. None of the photos showed children in states of undress or in vulnerable positions. None were taken in the cabins. Every single image showed fully clothed campers engaged in supervised activities. If Ryan was actually taking photos for the website, these cabin changing room shots wouldn't exist. They served a different purpose entirely. "Ethan, has Counselor Ryan ever told you not to mention the photos to your parents?" I asked. My nephew thought for a moment. He said parents sometimes worry about weird things because of social media dangers, so it's easier if we don't bother them with details about camp photography. He said we're all just being normal kids at camp and there's nothing wrong with documentation. The manipulation was sophisticated. Ryan was preemptively undermining the children's ability to report by framing parental concern as overreaction. He was normalizing the exploitation by calling it documentation. He was isolating the victims by suggesting that mentioning the photos would unnecessarily worry their parents. This wasn't opportunistic predation. This was calculated, systematic abuse by someone who understood exactly how to exploit institutional trust and childhood innocence. I needed to see this counselor's background immediately. "Which cabin are you in? How many counselors work there?" I asked. Ethan counted on his fingers. "Cabin 7. There are 12 boys, ages 10 to 12. We have 2 counselors assigned to us. Counselor Ryan is the lead counselor. He's been working at Pinecrest for 5 years. He's really popular because he knows all the best camp games and tells funny stories at night. The other counselor is Counselor Brett, but he's only part-time, and he's usually running activities at the archery range during the afternoon when Ryan takes the photos. So Ryan had deliberately structured his schedule to have unsupervised access to the children during vulnerable times. The part-time counselor conveniently absent. The photos taken in private spaces rather than public areas. This was planned exploitation using the camp's trusted environment as cover. I called my sister Laura immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice harried from her shift at the hospital where she worked as an emergency room nurse. "Derek, thanks for picking up Ethan. Keith and I should be done by 7. Can you keep him for dinner?" I skipped the pleasantries. "Laura, I need you to listen carefully. Ethan just told me something about his camp counselor that's extremely concerning. One of his counselors has been photographing the boys while they're changing out of their swimsuits in the cabin. He's telling them it's for the camp website. The line went silent for 3 seconds. When Laura spoke again, her voice had shifted from tired to razor-sharp alert. She'd spent years in emergency medicine learning to recognize abuse indicators, and I heard that recognition click into place. Are you absolutely certain that's what Ethan said? Not just photos during swimming activities, but specifically while changing? I put the call on speaker so Ethan could hear. Ethan, tell your mom what you told me about Counselor Ryan and the camera. My nephew repeated the story, adding more details this time. He takes maybe 20 or 30 photos each time. He tells us to act natural, keep changing, don't look at the camera. Sometimes he asks us to turn around so he can get different angles. Last week, he asked me to pull my shirt off slowly because the lighting was perfect. He said photographers need to capture authentic moments. I heard Laura's sharp intake of breath. Derek, I'm leaving work right now. Keith can cover the rest of my shift. I'm coming to your apartment and we're calling the police immediately. This is child sexual exploitation. That counselor is producing illegal images. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. My son has been going to that camp for 3 years. How long has this been happening? How many other children? Those were exactly the questions I was already trying to answer. After Laura hung up, I looked at Ethan carefully. Has Counselor Ryan ever taken photos of you alone, without other boys present? Ethan shook his head. No, it's always during the group changing time after swimming. But sometimes he asks specific boys to stay longer after everyone else leaves. He asks them to help clean up the cabin or organize the swimming equipment. I've never been asked to stay alone. Thank God for that small mercy, though it meant Ryan had likely already identified other victims for more private sessions. The group photos were bad enough, but one-on-one photography sessions would indicate much more serious escalation. I needed to document everything Ethan remembered before his memories were potentially influenced by questioning. I grabbed my laptop and started recording. Ethan, I need you to tell me every single thing you can remember about these photo sessions. How many times has it happened? When did it start? Has Ryan ever touched you inappropriately while taking photos? Over the next 40 minutes, Ethan provided a detailed account that made my blood run cold. The photo sessions had started on the second day of this camp session, 3 weeks ago. They happened every day after the swimming period, which was scheduled from 2 hours to 3:30 in the afternoon. Ryan would send the part-time counselor to run archery activities, then return to the cabin with the boys ostensibly to ensure they changed into dry clothes and didn't leave wet swimsuits lying around. He'd pull out his professional camera, a Canon with a telephoto lens, and spend 15 to 20 minutes photographing the boys as they undressed, dried off, and changed into regular clothes. He gave constant instructions about positioning, lighting, and authentic behavior. He'd compliment specific boys on their athletic builds, their natural comfort in front of the camera, their photogenic qualities. Several times he'd asked boys to repeat actions, removing their shirts multiple times, or adjusting their shorts in ways that Ethan now recognized felt uncomfortable. Ryan had never directly touched any of the boys during photography, maintaining a physical distance that probably seemed professional but was actually calculated to avoid leaving physical evidence. The grooming was entirely verbal and visual. But Ethan mentioned something that made my legal training snap into focus. Last week, Ryan had shown the boys some of the photos on his camera's display screen, asking their opinions on which shots looked best. Ethan had seen dozens of images showing boys in various stages of undress, some with swimsuits pulled down while changing, others showing bare chests and backs, a few capturing boys bent over or in vulnerable positions. Laura arrived at my apartment 30 minutes after our call, her face pale and her hands trembling. Keith was right behind her, looking confused and angry. He was a high school teacher who coached basketball, and I could see him processing the implications of what I'd told Laura. We sat around my kitchen table while Ethan moved to the living room to watch television, giving the adults privacy. Laura spoke first, her voice tight. I vetted this camp thoroughly before enrolling Ethan. Pinecrest has been operating for 30 years. They have certification from the state's Youth Program Oversight Board. Their website talks extensively about safety protocols and background checks for all staff. How did someone like this get hired? That was the question that haunted every case of institutional child abuse. How did predators infiltrate trusted organizations? The answer was usually that they were skilled at presenting themselves as ideal candidates. They understood what language to use, what credentials to obtain, what references to provide. They often had years of experience working with children without incident because they were patient, careful, and methodical about selecting victims and creating opportunities. Keith was looking at me with desperate hope that I'd say this was a misunderstanding. Could Ethan be exaggerating? Maybe the counselor really is taking photos for legitimate purposes, and Ethan's interpretation is innocent misunderstanding, amplified by social media safety lessons at school. I pulled up the camp website on my laptop and showed him the photo galleries. Show me a single image here that was taken in a cabin while children were changing. Show me any photo that captures kids in vulnerable positions or states of undress. You won't find them because they don't put those images on the public website. Whatever Ryan is creating, it's not for Pinecrest's promotional materials. Keith stared at the screen, clicking through hundreds of innocent camp photos, and I watched his denial crumble into horrified understanding. Oh God! Oh my God! We've been sending Ethan to this camp for 3 years. Has this been happening the whole time? That was impossible to answer without investigating Ryan's full employment history, but I suspected this was recent. Predators often spent significant time establishing themselves as trustworthy before beginning exploitation. Ryan had probably worked at Pinecrest for years building credibility, gaining administrative trust, and learning the camp's supervision gaps before starting to produce exploitation material. The question was whether he was creating these images for personal use or distribution. If he was part of a network trading child exploitation material, the scope of victims could be massive. Laura was already on her phone. I'm calling the police. This is happening tonight. That counselor doesn't get another day of access to children. She dialed 911 and reported suspected child sexual exploitation at Pinecrest Summer Camp. The dispatcher took detailed information and said officers would respond to my apartment to take statements and that they'd be contacting the camp administration immediately. 2 patrol officers arrived within 20 minutes, followed shortly by Detective Sandra Reyes from the Sex Crimes Unit. Detective Reyes was in her early 40s with 15 years of experience investigating child exploitation cases. She sat down with Ethan and conducted a careful, age-appropriate interview that I recorded with her permission. Ethan repeated everything he'd told me, this time with Detective Reyes asking specific questions about timing, frequency, other witnesses, and Ryan's exact words during the photo sessions. When she finished interviewing Ethan, Detective Reyes spoke with the adults privately. Her expression was grim. What your nephew described is consistent with production of child sexual exploitation material. The scenario hits every marker. Private location, children in states of undress, professional camera equipment, instructions designed to capture specific poses, normalization through official justification, and isolation from other adults during the sessions. I'll be obtaining a warrant for Ryan Faust's electronics tonight, and we'll be executing that warrant tomorrow morning before he has a chance to destroy evidence. She paused and looked at Laura and Keith directly. I need you to understand that your son is likely a victim in images that may have been distributed online. If Faust was producing this material for a network, Ethan's images could be anywhere. That's a reality you'll need to help him process with professional support. Laura started crying. Keith put his arm around her and asked the question I'd been dreading. How many other children? If this has been happening for 3 weeks with daily photo sessions, and there are 12 boys in that cabin, how many victims are we talking about? Detective Reyes pulled out her notepad. Pinecrest runs 3-week sessions throughout the summer. This is the 2nd session. If Faust started this behavior at the beginning of the summer, we could be looking at 24 boys from the 1st session, plus the 12 from the current session. But I suspect this started more recently, possibly just this session. Predators usually don't risk exposure immediately. They build trust first. She looked at me. You said you're a defense attorney. You understand how these investigations work. We'll need to interview every child in that cabin, examine all of Faust's electronics, check his online activity, and determine if he's part of a larger network. This investigation will take months. But tonight, I'm getting that warrant and pulling Faust out of that camp before he can destroy evidence or harm any more children. I asked the question that had been burning in my mind. Has there been any previous investigation of Ryan Faust? Any prior complaints or red flags? Detective Reyes checked her tablet. I ran him through our database before coming here. Ryan Faust, age 32, 5 years at Pinecrest, previously worked at 2 other youth camps in neighboring states. No criminal record, no previous complaints on file. But that doesn't mean much. Most predators have years of undetected activity before their first arrest. I felt cold certainty settle in my chest. Ryan Faust had been doing this longer than 3 weeks. He'd been at Pinecrest for 5 years and worked at other camps before that. The 12 boys in Ethan's cabin were not his first victims. They might not even be his most recent victims. We were looking at the tip of a massive exploitation operation. Laura was thinking the same thing. We need to contact every parent who's ever had a child in a cabin supervised by Faust. Every family from every summer he's worked here. They all need to know their children might have been victimized. Detective Reyes nodded. The camp administration will be required to provide records of all campers who had contact with Faust. We'll be interviewing staff members to determine if anyone else was aware of his activities or should have noticed concerning behavior. This is going to be a comprehensive investigation. She stood and prepared to leave. I'll update you as the investigation progresses. In the meantime, I recommend you contact Child Advocacy Services to arrange counseling for Ethan. Even if he wasn't physically touched, being photographed in that context is traumatizing, and he'll need professional support to process this. After the police left, Laura held Ethan tightly while Keith and I discussed next steps. We needed to pull Ethan out of camp immediately. We needed to notify the camp director about the investigation. We needed to find other parents whose children might have been victimized. And we needed to prepare for the emotional aftermath of Ethan learning that he'd been exploited by someone he trusted. Laura called the camp director at home that night. Angela Drummond had been running Pinecrest for 12 years, and her initial response was defensive disbelief. Ryan Faust is one of our most dedicated counselors. He's beloved by the children. He's passed every background check. He has excellent references from previous positions. There must be some misunderstanding. Laura's voice turned icy. The police will be executing a search warrant at your camp tomorrow morning. They're investigating Ryan Faust for production of child sexual exploitation material. You'll want to cooperate fully with that investigation and review every single safety protocol that allowed this to happen under your supervision. Angela's tone shifted immediately to bureaucratic concern. I'll notify our legal counsel and insurance carrier immediately. We'll cooperate completely with law enforcement. But I want to be clear that Pinecrest has strict policies against any inappropriate contact between staff and campers. If Faust violated those policies, he did so in ways that deliberately circumvented our safety measures. That was the institutional response I'd expected. Deny responsibility, blame the predator for being deceptive, emphasize policies that failed to prevent abuse. Angela was already protecting the camp's liability rather than focusing on victim welfare. Keith recognized it too. What about the other children? Have you notified parents that there's an active investigation? Are you removing Faust from access to campers tonight? Angela hesitated, and I heard the calculation in her pause. She was weighing legal liability against public relations disaster. Finally, she said, Ryan Faust will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. I'll be sending a letter to all parents tomorrow informing them of the situation and offering counseling resources. But I can't discuss specifics of an active police investigation. She was minimizing and delaying. Standard institutional crisis management that prioritized the organization over the victims. Laura hung up and turned to me with fury in her eyes. She's going to bury this. She's going to protect the camp's reputation instead of the children. We can't let that happen. I'd seen this pattern too many times. Institutions closed ranks when faced with abuse allegations. They hired expensive lawyers, issued carefully worded statements, settled with victims under confidentiality agreements, and continued operating while claiming they'd learned lessons and improved protocols. Meanwhile, victims struggled with trauma while predators often moved to new organizations and continued their abuse. We needed to make this public in a way that forced accountability. The next morning, Detective Reyes executed the search warrant at Pinecrest Summer Camp at 6 a.m. They removed Ryan Faust from his cabin before the campers woke up, seized his camera equipment, laptop, phone, and personal belongings, and took him to the station for questioning. The camp went into lockdown with counselors trying to explain to confused children why police cars were parked outside and why Counselor Ryan was gone. By 9 a.m., Detective Reyes called me with preliminary findings that confirmed every terrible suspicion. Ryan Faust's laptop contained over 3,000 images of children in various states of undress, taken inside Camp Pinecrest cabins over the past 2 years. The images showed boys between ages 8 and 14, many captured during the exact scenario Ethan had described. The metadata on the photos confirmed they'd been taken during afternoon hours when official camp schedules showed swimming activities. Most damning forensic analysis of Faust's hard drive revealed deleted files showing he'd been uploading images to encrypted file-sharing networks used by child exploitation rings. He wasn't just producing material for personal use. He was distributing it internationally. We've identified at least 40 distinct children in these images, Detective Reyes told me, her voice tight with controlled anger. That's 40 families who need to be notified that their children were victimized. Faust has been arrested and charged with multiple counts of producing, possessing, and distributing child sexual exploitation material. He's being held without bail. But Derek, we found something else on his computer. Communication logs showing he was in contact with at least 6 other individuals who work at youth camps and schools across the country. This is a network. Faust wasn't working alone. The scope was staggering. This wasn't one predator at one camp. This was an organized ring of individuals in positions of trust coordinating to exploit children and trade images. I immediately called Laura and Keith with the update. Keith was silent for a long moment before speaking. How do we tell Ethan? How do we explain that the counselor he trusted was doing this? That images of him might be on the internet forever? That was the question that had no good answer. The exploitation images would be reported and removed from mainstream platforms, but once something entered the dark web networks, complete eradication was nearly impossible. Ethan and the other victims would have to live with knowing that their images existed somewhere, seen by people they'd never meet, exploited in ways they'd never fully understand. Laura's voice was steady despite her tears. We tell him the truth, at an age-appropriate level. We explain that Counselor Ryan was doing something very wrong that had nothing to do with Ethan being bad or doing anything to deserve this. We make sure he knows he's not alone, that many children were hurt by this person, and that adults are working to make sure Ryan never hurts anyone again. And we get him professional help immediately. They scheduled an appointment with a child psychologist who specialized in sexual abuse trauma. I started compiling information about victim resources and legal options, and I began researching how to organize the other families whose children had been victimized. By that afternoon, Angela Drummond sent out a carefully worded letter to all current and former Pinecrest families explaining that a staff member had been arrested on serious charges and that the camp was cooperating fully with law enforcement. The letter was maddeningly vague, never naming Ryan Faust or specifying the nature of the charges, emphasizing the camp's commitment to safety while avoiding any acknowledgement of systemic failures that had allowed 2 years of exploitation to continue undetected. The letter infuriated me. It was designed to minimize legal liability rather than prioritize victim support. Parents reading it wouldn't understand the severity of what had happened or whether their own children had been victimized. Angela was hoping to control information flow and limit the public relations damage rather than ensuring every affected family received proper notification and resources. I called Detective Reyes and asked about protocols for victim notification. She explained that detectives were already in the process of contacting families of identified children, but it was slow work requiring careful coordination with child advocacy services. Families would be notified individually over the next week. But Derek, here's the problem. We've only identified 40 children from the images we've recovered. If Faust was distributing images through encrypted networks and those images were downloaded by network members, we may never know the full scope of exploitation. Some images might have been deleted from his devices. Some victims might not be identifiable. This investigation could take years to fully unravel. Years, during which families would live in uncertainty, children would struggle with trauma. Faust's network contacts would continue operating unless they were identified and arrested. I couldn't accept that timeline. That night, I did something that probably violated professional ethics, but felt morally necessary. I contacted a journalist named Marcus Leopold, who specialized in investigative reporting about institutional failures and child safety. I explained the situation at Pinecrest, providing him with information that was already public record from Faust's arrest, along with general details about the systemic failures that had allowed 2 years of exploitation. Marcus was interested immediately. He'd been tracking a national pattern of youth camps and schools failing to prevent staff sexual abuse, and the Pinecrest case fit his investigation perfectly. He requested an interview with our family, which Laura and Keith agreed to after consulting with Detective Reyes. The detective wasn't thrilled about media involvement, but acknowledged that public pressure sometimes accelerated investigations and prompted other victims to come forward. The article ran 3 days later in the city's major newspaper under the headline, "Summer Camp Trust Shattered. Counselor Arrested for Systematic Child Exploitation. Families Demand Accountability." The piece was devastating for Pinecrest. Marcus had interviewed multiple families, documented the camp's inadequate safety protocols, obtained Angela Drummond's defensive statements, and provided expert commentary about how institutions often prioritize reputation over protection. The article specifically named Ryan Faust, detailed the charges against him, explained the scale of exploitation, and called for comprehensive reform of camp oversight regulations. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Parents flooded Pinecrest with demands for information. Local news stations picked up the story. State legislators announced plans to review youth camp regulations. And most importantly, additional victims started coming forward. Over the next week, 15 more families contacted police, reporting that their children had been in cabins supervised by Ryan Faust and had mentioned uncomfortable photo sessions. The victims included children from both the current summer and previous years. Each family's story followed the same pattern: the counselor with the camera, the explanation about camp website photos, the normalization of being photographed while changing, the isolation from other adults during vulnerable times. Detective Reyes coordinated what became one of the largest child exploitation investigations in the state's history. A task force was assembled including FBI agents who specialized in online networks. The 40 initial victims grew to 68 identified children as more families came forward and forensic analysis recovered additional deleted images from Faust's devices. The investigation expanded to other camps where Faust had previously worked, revealing that he'd been producing exploitation material for at least 7 years across 3 states. Even more disturbing, the FBI identified 5 other individuals in Faust's network who worked at youth programs. Arrests followed in 4 different states. The network had been operating for years, with members trading tips about how to gain access to children, avoid detection, and produce images without arousing suspicion. They'd shared specific techniques for grooming children and normalizing photography in vulnerable contexts. Faust had been one of the most prolific producers in the network, creating thousands of images over his career. The trial was scheduled for 6 months after his arrest, but Faust's attorney negotiated a plea agreement when faced with overwhelming evidence. Faust pleaded guilty to 32 counts of producing child sexual exploitation material, 18 counts of distributing such material, and multiple counts of child endangerment. The plea agreement required him to provide detailed information about his network contacts and methods in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by lifetime supervised release and registration as a sex offender. At sentencing, several victim families provided impact statements. Laura stood at the podium with Keith beside her and spoke about Ethan's trauma, his nightmares, his struggle to trust adults, his fear that images of him existed somewhere on the internet forever. My son went to summer camp expecting fun and friendship. Instead, he was systematically exploited by someone we trusted completely. Ryan Faust used his position of authority to violate children's privacy and innocence for his own gratification and profit. No sentence can undo that harm, but we hope it sends a clear message that institutions must do better to protect the children in their care. I provided a statement as well, speaking about the systemic failures that had enabled Faust's crimes. This exploitation continued for 2 years because adults trusted an institution's reputation more than children's discomfort. Multiple children mentioned feeling uncomfortable during photo sessions, but their concerns were dismissed or rationalized. The camp's safety protocols were inadequate, supervision was insufficient, and accountability was non-existent. We need comprehensive reform requiring enhanced background checks, surprise inspections of youth facilities, mandatory training for staff on recognizing grooming behavior, and most importantly, creating environments where children feel empowered to report concerns without fear. Their worries will be dismissed. The judge acknowledged the statements and added his own comments about the severity of Faust's crimes and the lifelong impact on victims. Ryan Faust stood emotionless throughout, showing no remorse, saying nothing beyond his formal guilty plea. As he was led away in handcuffs, I felt satisfaction that he'd been held accountable, but also rage that the system had allowed so much harm before intervention. The civil litigation against Pinecrest Summer Camp followed quickly. 43 families filed a class action lawsuit alleging negligent supervision, failure to implement adequate safety protocols, and institutional failure to protect children. The camp's insurance carrier settled for $8.3 million rather than risk a trial that would expose their failures in public testimony. Angela Drummond resigned as camp director under pressure from the board. Pinecrest implemented comprehensive new safety measures, including mandatory background checks every 6 months, surprise inspections of all facilities, prohibition of private photography by staff, installation of security cameras in all common areas, and requirement that no counselor could be alone with campers at any time. But the reforms came too late for 68 children who'd already been victimized. The network investigation continued for 2 years, eventually resulting in 23 arrests across 6 states. The FBI dismantled one of the largest child exploitation networks they'd encountered, seizing over 100,000 illegal images and identifying hundreds of victims. Several of Faust's network contacts worked at schools, churches, athletic programs, and other youth organizations. The scope revealed how deeply predators had infiltrated institutions that families trusted. Media coverage of the investigation prompted national conversation about child safety in institutional settings. Advocacy organizations used the Pinecrest case as an example of why enhanced regulation was necessary. Several states passed laws requiring stricter oversight of youth camps, mandatory reporting training for all staff who work with children, and criminal penalties for institutional administrators who knowingly failed to report suspected abuse. Ethan's recovery was slow and painful. He worked with therapists twice weekly, processing the betrayal of trust, learning that the exploitation wasn't his fault, developing strategies for managing anxiety and hypervigilance. He stopped attending any overnight camps or programs with unsupervised adult access. He struggled with trust issues that affected his relationships with teachers, coaches, and other authority figures. Laura and Keith attended family therapy to learn how to support him while managing their own guilt and anger. 3 years after Ryan Faust's arrest, I ran into Angela Drummond at a legal conference. She'd taken a position as a consultant helping youth organizations implement safety protocols, trying to prevent other institutions from making the mistakes Pinecrest had made. We spoke briefly, awkwardly, about the changes she was advocating. She admitted that Pinecrest's failures haunted her daily. I believed we were doing everything right. Background checks, training, supervision policies. But I realize now that policies on paper don't mean anything if staff aren't actually following them, and leadership isn't actively looking for warning signs. Ryan Faust exploited gaps between policy and practice. He understood that as long as he seemed professional and his victims didn't complain loudly enough, nobody would question his behavior closely. I should have questioned more. I should have done surprise cabin inspections. I should have talked to campers privately about whether anything made them uncomfortable. I failed those children. Her remorse seemed genuine, but it didn't undo the harm. Institutional accountability required more than individual regret. It required systematic cultural change prioritizing child safety over reputation management, creating reporting systems where children's concerns were taken seriously, and implementing oversight mechanisms that didn't rely on trust alone. Ethan is 16 now. He struggled, but survived. He advocates for other exploitation victims through an online support network. He speaks at schools about recognizing grooming behavior and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. Last month, he gave a presentation to a group of camp counselors about how to create safe environments for children. He told them about that casual comment he made to me 5 years ago, how one sentence spoken to a trusted adult had stopped ongoing exploitation and prevented future victims. I didn't realize at the time how serious it was. Counselor Ryan had made taking photos seem so normal that I didn't recognize it as abuse. But my uncle recognized it immediately because he listened to what I was saying rather than dismissing it. That's what adults need to do. Listen when children tell you something feels wrong, even if it seems insignificant. Trust their instincts. Investigate concerns thoroughly. Don't wait until something terrible happens to take action. The counselors listened with serious attention, and afterward several approached Ethan to thank him for his courage in speaking about such personal trauma. I watched from the back of the room, proud of how he'd transformed his victimization into purpose, how he was working to protect other children from what had happened to him. Justice hadn't been swift or simple, but it had been achieved through persistence, documentation, public pressure, and the willingness of victims to speak up despite shame and fear. Ryan Faust would die in prison. His network had been dismantled. 68 children had received acknowledgement that their exploitation wasn't their fault, and that the adults who should have protected them had finally done their job. That knowledge, imperfect as it was, made the long fight worthwhile. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.